Okay, protectionism. Right, we may have heard the word every now and then, but this is what we're actually going to be taking a look at. Protectionism is basically the government telling us how we're going to trade. Now remember, more government involvement means more socialist economy. Right? We're heading the other way on that scale that we had. Capitalism was this side, socialism was this side. We're heading this way the more protectionist we have. And we're going to see what happens when we start talking about what are the effects on the economy with protectionism. Okay? A capitalist economy does not support this. This is one of the things that Adam Smith came through, and he said we have to freely trade. We don't want to go ahead and do protectionism. Now, we will do some of this in some cases, such as in the military. Right? The last thing we want to do is go ahead and build our best and fastest and most advanced weapon systems and sell them to an adversary, such as maybe China. Right? So what we'll do is we will put restrictions on what military hardware produced in the U.S. can be sent overseas and what can't. So as we look at this part, there is a reason that there is some protectionism. Again, capitalism isn't lack of government, it's government protecting our rights. And the military, one of the things it does do is it protects our freedoms from other nations. Now the second thing is protecting certain industries. Now we can go ahead and say, well, that doesn't sound right. And if you go with pure capitalism, if we can't compete with some other country, maybe we shouldn't be in the business, because that's the whole concept of the invisible hand. Now that works out great unless other countries aren't playing by the same free trade rules. So we will want to get into this also. We'll talk about fair trade on the last part of this. Then of course it's actually, hey, we need the jobs. Right? Right now we have 22 million people unemployed. And that's over the last 3 weeks. 22 million people. Now here's a question for you. Should we still be bringing in people from all over the world that want to go ahead and have a piece of the American dream, if right now, over the last 3 weeks, we just had 22 million American citizens dumped from the American dream? Shouldn't the jobs go to American citizens first and then go to folks from other countries? Question to ask yourself. Now, here is a concept of this when we talk about fair or free trade. Right now, we see we've got $504 billion worth of goods coming to the U.S. $130 billion going to China. Wait a minute, China's not buying as much. What we're doing here is we're transferring wealth from the United States. Remember what England was doing with their colonies? Same thing's happening here. Same thing's happening between China and the European Union. Transferring wealth from Europe to China. And guess what? Where's Europe making that up from? Transferring wealth from the United States to Europe. So here are some of the things we need to take a look at. The more protectionist we get, sometimes the dumber we do. Now here's the example we're going to go ahead and use. We're going to use sports cars. Why? Because when I was in the Navy in 1980, I decided I needed to have a Datsun 240Z. Right? Now Datsun doesn't even exist as a company anymore. It's called Nissan. But back then, it was the Datsun or the Mustang. Those were the basic two foreign and domestic cars when you were looking for sports cars. Right? So yeah. I was on the West Virginia up in New London, Connecticut, and I got this sports car. And man, I love that sports car. Matter of fact, when I test drove it, I'm out there, I'm driving on a little windy road right along next to a river going from New London to Norwich. It's about 30 miles up the road. And I'm just driving, I'm having a good old time. And then in this 35-mile-an-hour zone, I look at my speedometer and I'm going 75. And yeah, we'll just say that I had a few run-ins with some folks with some green and red lights on occasion. But that's the example. We're going to start talking about producing and buying these two cars. So what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and get the protectionist note sheet from your stuff, because we're going to be filling this one out. Okay? Now, here's the example. Now, this isn't factual, right? This is the example we're using, but the example works along the same way. Okay? In our example, the demand for sports cars in the U.S. is 20,000. That was a little bit more back then, but the numbers work out easier this way. The Americans supplied 11,000 of those. So Detroit, Ford could only go ahead and produce 11,000 cars, which meant we had to get them from someplace else. So we looked at Japan. Now Japan was selling sports cars for 8,000. We were selling them for 10. Go, ooh, wait a minute. You're going to go ahead and go to the car dealerships and you want to get a sports car, you buy the $8,000 or the $10,000 car. Probably not the one that costs more. So we're buying Japanese sports cars to beat the band. Now here's the problem. In Detroit, the big three are going, Japan's outselling us. Not just in sports cars, but in a lot of other things too. Okay? But what they did is they scratched their heads and they went, we'll get the politicians in on this. So they go talk to the politicians and they say, you know what, you gotta stop this. If not, we're gonna have to go ahead and lay people off. And when we lay those people off, we're gonna let them know we did it because you, Mr. Congressman, Miss Senator, could not fix this, what Japan must be doing is price gouging, which they weren't. This was actually the real price of a Japanese car, including transportation to the United States. But that's not how the big three were seeing it. So at this point, the politicians are going, hey, no problem. What we'll do is we'll come up and we'll put this idea of tariffs onto the Japanese vehicles. Now tariffs, nothing more than tax on imports. In other words, we're going to tax those Japanese cars. And what would be a fair tax? Well, according to the folks in Detroit, tax them as high as it's going to cost so that now all the cars cost $10,000. So we put a tax of $2,000 on those cars. You go, whoa, wait a minute. So let's take a look at that. Car buyers are paying $2,000 more for every car bought. In other words, households. Right, we're having to spend $2,000 more. So we take a look at this, here's our budget. And let's say for the year, we're spending $32,400. Well, to buy that car during that year, we need to figure out what we're going to get rid of so that we have that extra $2,000. In other words, our standard of living goes down. So what ends up happening is the 9,000 folks that were buying those Japanese cars at that particular moment in time are all now having to pay $2,000 more, or $18 million of money they shouldn't have had to spend on the car. In other words, our spending going to the product market dropped $18 million. Think about that. If you were buying the car, it dropped $2,000. Your standard of living dropped $2,000. Now, once we found this out, we got a little bit peeved. And who did we get peeved at? Yeah, the folks that we found out put the tariffs on. And of course, when election time comes up, we fired them. So a new round of politicians comes in. And they go, yay! Problem is this is still here, our problem. these folks still need somebody to stop that, and they go to the new set of politicians, telling them the same thing. If you don't stop it, we're not only going to go ahead and tell everybody that you're the one that got them laid off, but we're going to give campaign contributions to your opponent. So you go, oh, no, we don't want to do that. We know tariffs won't work, but we're going to put quotas on everything that comes into the U.S. Quotas. Okay? Now, what's a quota? Right? That's on your sheet over there. By the way, most of the time, anytime you see this little yellow finger here, probably means that there's something you should be writing on your note sheet. So, quotas are just a max allowed in of a particular product. So, and by the way, a quota of 0, we also call an embargo or a sanction. In other words, they're not allowed to bring any in. Right? Nothing's allowed in at a quota of 0. So we go ahead and say, hey, how many cars in Detroit can you supply? Well, they say 11,000. Say, great, not a problem. We'll put a quota of 9,000. Now here's the deal. All 20,000 could have bought that car. But now we're only going to go ahead and let 9,000 in. So everybody that was buying that wanted a car, once the first 9,000 Japanese cars are gone, the only ones they can buy are the 11,000 American-made cars. And you go, whoa, wait a minute. Really? Because if I do that correctly, I've got 11,000 car buyers that are now having to figure out what they're going to give up so they have that extra $2,000 for their car. So we go, that also equates to $22 million in our economy. Or in other words, this is down $22 million. Now here's the thing. We're not just accepting, this isn't just from this one household buying the car. Remember when we did the circle paper? If they're not spending that $22 million here, what else aren't they spending the money on? Okay, we cut down going out to dinner. Oh, wait a minute. The owner of the restaurant only sees half of the people out there. What do? Lay off half their staff. All of a sudden, half their staff is not getting income. Now they're not spending money in something else. And just like in that circle paper, our economy starts shrinking. So it's not just that 22 million for that one time around the circle. As they're not spending in other businesses. So as demand goes down, we shrink. And of course we get ticked off again because we find out our standard of living went down. And we know these guys did it. So we go ahead and fire them. We bring a new batch. But the problem's still there. Big three come over, hey, you got to stop it. And they go, well, hey, quotas and tariffs don't work. We'll do subsidies. We go, yay, subsidies sound great. Okay, so what we're going to do is we take a look and we go, well, subsidies is nothing more than money given to, in this case, the big three in Detroit from every taxpayer in the country. And remember, this one and this one, this was just on the people buying the sports car. Now, we're talking about everybody in the country is going to go ahead and have to pay for somebody else's sports car. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to give all 11,000 cars, because remember, U.S. only can supply 11,000 sports cars. But we're going to give Detroit $2,000 for every one of those 11,000 cars they produce. So they can still sell them. Instead of for 10 grand, they can cut it down to 8. Why? Because the government gave them a $2,000 check when they produced it. So we take a look at this, and now we have all U.S. taxpayers paying $2,000 a car for 11,000 cars. But first off, now people all across the country, not $2,000 maybe it's $200, $300, $400. Because remember, we're going all around the country now. Because all taxpayers are having to pay this. But it still drops what everybody in the country is paying, $22 million. So again, we have a problem here. Right? spending is dropping. Taxes. Oh. We find out, we're really upset now that everybody in the country is having to pay their taxes to buy these cars. And they go, well, it doesn't go necessarily directly that way. Well, the check goes to Detroit, but where does it come from? It could come from your college tuition. You now have to pay 10% higher tuition. Could be from your books. You may have to spend more on those. All this government spending that they're providing us stuff with, well, they have to cut back a little bit. Or they increase the taxes on our paychecks a little bit. Either way, everybody's paying this. And these are the folks that set it up. So again, yes, you got it. We fire them. And we elect a new group. Problem's still here. Big three are still here. Need to get it stopped. We got the folks here again. Let's see, quotas don't work. Tariffs don't work. Subsidies don't work. Ah, I got it. We'll bring in barriers. Now, what actually is a barrier? Well, barriers literally are some kind of restriction on imports. Okay? We put some kind of a standard that that thing has to go ahead and go through. In other words, make happen. And we can go ahead and, in the case of the sports cars, because just one of those sports cars might possibly be sold in California, we're going to go ahead and tell Japan that they have to put all of the car smog controls that the most restrictive state in the United States requires on vehicles sold there. So Japan can't say, well, we're not going to sell any in California. No, we're going to sell them in the other 49 states. Said, no, one of them might be sold there. So you have to have them for all of the country. And we'll just use our example and say that that amounted to another $2,000 cost in putting together the car. Right? If you don't do it, you can't bring them in. So what happened? Demand for 20,000, of course. We produce 11. All those other 9,000 cars, because Japan said, hey, you know what? We're not making any profit. We're not sending any to the United States. All of a sudden we have a shortage. And this creates two problems. The first off, what happens in a shortage? Well, what happens? Price goes up. So now the cost of the car goes up. Now, we're only going to assume that this shortage is going to increase the cost by, let's say, $2,000. Okay? So now, the car goes from $10,000 to $12,000. Well, wait a minute. See this $2,000? Yeah, that's what we think the car went up. But remember, it's actually $4,000. Because we can't buy it for $8,000. We're not buying it for $10,000 anymore because we've got a shortage. Price went up. Now we're buying it for $12,000. So this, instead of $2,000, should be $4,000 right here. And instead of $4,000, which would increase to $22 million, we're now talking about $44 million. $44 million of spending. In other words, twice what it was doing before is now not happening for other things because we want to get these sports cars. And then comes the kicker. Something called the exclusion principle pops in. And what's the exclusion principle? It means if you don't have the money to buy it, or it's not there, you can't buy it. Remember the aggregate demand model? When we have a shortage, in this case price cars, inflation brings the price up, which is what happened. But it also means that when the production was coming over here, the production hit a halt. We can only produce 11,000 of those cars. The other 9,000 went without. That's the exclusion principle. Now we're really ticked off. And of course we look at our politicians, we fire them, we still got these folks here, but guess what? By this time, America was able to get the price down to $8,000. Now, how did this happen? Well, if you remember, World War II, we literally firebombed Japan back into the Stone Age. Curtis LeMay, the general of the Army Air Corps that was fighting Japan, even once came out with a comment that if we had lost the war, he would have been set up for war crimes because the firebombings were indiscriminate. Remember, most Japanese cities were made out of paper. So when we firebombed, they had huge amounts of casualties. As a matter of fact, the firebombing in Tokyo, in just one firebomb, was more than both atomic bombs that we dropped. But that's a little history tidbit there for you. But here's the thing. After World War II, we decided to rebuild Japan. So we brought over all the latest technologies and we loaned them money to build factories. So now they had factories that were using late 1940s, 1950s technology. Now, let's look at what the U.S. was doing. Now, granted, we were using 1940s technology, but before we got there, if you remember, again, going back to the aggregate demand model, in a recession, we have excess capacity. In other words, we had old factories that weren't being used anymore. So what did we do? We opened up factories that were using 1910, 1920, 1930s technology. And we'd go ahead and upgrade some of it as we could, but a good portion of our manufacturing process was 1930s, 1940s technology, and we were competing with late 40s, early 50s technology. And just like England, when they started their Industrial Revolution, Japan didn't stop. They didn't say, okay, we're good. No, they kept making their factories better, faster, and cheaper, faster than we were. So, come the 80s, Japan is able to put out a car that's $2,000 cheaper than ours because they're using better technology. Well, during this time frame that we had all of this muss and stuff going on with our economy and Detroit messing with our politicians, they were on a better, faster, and cheaper concept. So that by the time they ran out of their basic political options, they were now not only being able to compete, but shortly thereafter exceed the quality control and the cost of a Japanese car. So they were able to go ahead and compete worldwide and globally again. But this exclusion principle, prior to getting all of our costs up, better, faster, and cheaper, so we can now equal the Japanese with costs, we were getting really hit. And this was a very large drag on our economy, just like the circle paper. You saw that we're not spending that money in our economy. And if we're not spending it there, we're not creating demand. If we're not creating demand, somebody else is either not getting a job or getting laid off. If they're getting laid off, our economy is shrinking. If they're not getting a job, it's not increasing. So that's where we end up for protectionism. And we'll head into the concept of free trade in a bit.